Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we will be updating the power rankings once again for Australian Survivor Blood vs. Water following week 6 or episode 16. And admittedly, this was a largely stagnant week in terms of the power rankings. I feel like not much changed in terms of the overall contenders, who's at the top, who's at the bottom. But we're going to run through this anyway, sort of give my update and my general thoughts on the last two episodes we just watched. But let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting at the list at number 11, we have the boot from this week. We have Jesse. And this was an interesting week for Jesse, where obviously in episode 15, he's alongside Jordy and Sam for much of it. After Jordy wins the reward, he's selected for it. And obviously it's there that Jordy finds an idol clue, which he then passes off to Jesse. Later on, he's shown being on board with the Josh blindside. However, Mark and Josh are plotting his own blindside, largely due to Jordy winning immunity. We see Jesse sense that things aren't going right, prompting him to go idol hunting. And while he does find the idol, Sam catches him and somehow convinces him to hand it over to her to hold on to. Now, it does turn out later that she does hang on to it for his blindside, and she ultimately gets to keep it, which is just kind of weird. But he seems convinced Sam has his back until, again, he's blindsided. And as he's heading out, he tells Jordy that Sam has his idol, and it's all a pretty fun scene on the whole. And overall, I feel like Jesse played a pretty solid game for the most part. I was very impressed by his pre-merge game where he and Sam were pretty well positioned. He used Sandra as a meat shield, where he was a swing vote during the J boot. At the swap, he's an integral figure in both blind sides, as well as avoiding suspicion. I find it very impressive how his bond with Ben was strong enough to where Ben told him about Croc's plan to blindside him, then allowing him to flip tables against Croc. And while he can question whether it was a right move for Jesse to turn on Ben, even after demonstrating a great deal of loyalty to him, I still think it demonstrates Jesse's effective social game and threat management. Even after the merge, I felt like he was in a pretty solid position with Sam loyal to him and Jordy, being more on front than them. And it's really Jordy winning immunity that screws him over. And while it's a knock that he didn't play his idol despite being suspicious that votes might be coming onto him, it's not enough to discredit his entire game. And while I had a feeling that a blindside was coming soon, I wasn't expecting Sam to actually flip on him that soon, which is something at least. But again, I feel like he played a pretty solid game on the whole, and he's here at number 11. And with that, we are now moving to the 10 players still in the game. And like I said, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think it is that they'll win from this point, based on the edit and overall storylines that they demonstrated so far. But at number 10, we have the player I think is the least likely to win at this point, and that is Shale. And it's sort of weird because I kind of have her in the same spot as if she were voted out and was actually eliminated from the game. And she was voted out. However, she was ultimately spared by a non-elimination round, being sent to Purgatory, which I'm guessing is similar to Redemption Rock from Brains vs. Brawn. But in terms of her content from this week, I mean, it wasn't really much. Like I said, she's still on the bottom of her tribe for the most part, while not getting that much content of her actually being on the bottom or doing much to get herself off the bottom. It's more so other players sort of dictating what's happening. And she's really spared. I mean, during that episode 15 where, again, she could have been the boot there, had other players not decided to make bigger moves there. And obviously in episode 16, while there was a movement by Jordy to blindside Mark, ultimately Mark's alliance prevailed and they got rid of Shale as a result, but not knowing that she's in Purgatory right now. And overall, again, I'm not feeling great about Shale. I mean, I feel like she really hasn't gotten that much screen time, even as an underdog, which is really worrying for me. Now, I do think there's a solid chance she could come back into the game through Purgatory. I feel like depending on who actually goes home next and who she has to actually compete against in the challenge or whatever, I feel like there is a solid chance that she could win that and come back into the game. It's just a matter of how far she can make it beyond that point, and I'm not feeling too great about it, as I feel like she hasn't really demonstrated the ability to keep the target off her back. While she isn't the worst player in the world, I feel like even if she comes back into the game, people will just see her as an easy target again to sort of hold things off for another round, which is pretty underwhelming at the end of the day, but it's just how I feel about the state of things. And because of that, I have her here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and I feel like this person has been pretty invisible this week, and here we have Michelle, and I contemplate between her and the next person we'll be talking about, but I feel like Michelle has kind of not gone that much screen time. I mean, in episode 15, she did get a confessional after the tribal talking about losing Mel and how she could be on the outs now, and she is on the outs, to be fair, but she isn't being directly targeted at the next tribal. We do hear talk about Josh being the biggest threat, as obviously her and Mel were trying to get Josh out at their last tribal together, only for that plan to not go through. And while she does get to talk about Josh being a big threat in episode 15, that doesn't really come to fruition. Again, they blindside Jesse instead. Then in episode 16, they're pretty invisible for the most part. I feel like they're not really relevant to the story. And again, I mean, I feel like they have very little chance of winning the game at this point. And I feel like compared to this next person, they don't really have much storyline going for them, even in the episodes that we talked about. So because of that, I have her here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and this person's also largely invisible, but I feel like they have slightly more story going on, at least from this week's episode. And here we have David. Now the main thing that puts David above Michelle for me is the fact that we learned that David is part of a core of Josh and Chrissy. And while we never hear David's perspective on this core or his relationships to either of those players, I feel like it's still somewhat in David's favor that he is a part of this core, and that core is mentioned throughout both of these episodes. And then obviously in episode 16, he is presented as a swing vote ahead of the tribal, where he's decided he could go either way, although he obviously sides with the Mark group to blindside JL, so that's something at least. But aside from that, we get very little content from David. A lot of it feels very circumstantial for me, and while we do learn more about his relationships, and that probably demonstrates some game ability in the sense that he's able to build allies, I feel like it's not really enough to propel him to serious winner contention, and because of that, I have him here at number 8. Now I'm moving on to number 7, and this person's largely similar to David in that they're largely invisible, but at least somewhat relevant to the gameplay, and here we have Jordan. And Jordan, again, has been largely invisible in the edit. I feel like he didn't really get that much content in either episode, really. But the main thing that keeps him in somewhat contention is the fact that he is related to Josh, who has been getting a bit more content than him. And obviously now it seems like he's part of the core that's running the game of him, Josh, Mark, and Sam. So that's something at least that could definitely get him further into the game. But again, he's still largely invisible in the edit. I don't feel like he's winning the game. And because of that, I have him here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6. And this person's been largely invisible as well, especially lately. But I feel like they still have some potential to be relevant in the gameplay. And here we have KJ. And the thing about KJ is, obviously she had that storyline shortly before the merge of her getting closer to the men, especially to Jordy. And through that, there was potential for her to infiltrate that alliance and eventually be able to blindside Jordy. And I still think there's still some potential for her to have a role in that moving forward, but I don't think she's winning the game, as even as an underdog figure, she has been pretty quiet in the edit lately, and I feel like she hasn't been relevant all that much. I mean, we hear her being talked as being part of the bottom, but aside from that, we don't really hear her respond to that all that much. And that's a big reason that I don't really have her in that serious winner contention anymore. But again, she still has that potential to be involved in the Jordy blindside down the road. So because of that, I have her a bit higher than these people at number 6. Now I'm moving on to number 5, and this is sort of a weird person to talk about. And here we have Josh. And the thing about Josh is, again, I don't feel like he has any real shot of winning based on his edit. And I feel like, again, he was kind of invisible, or at least in episode 16 he was invisible. Episode 15 was a bit better for him in terms of him getting to talk about his position in the game, how he has his core of him, David, and Chrissy, which is something at least. And I feel like he is one of the better players on the island right now, where he is in the majority. He has a number of core allies, especially with Mark. I feel like the fact that Mark wasn't willing to turn on Josh is a sign of Josh's gameplay. Mind you, I feel like some of that is due to the edit showing that Josh was more willing to flip on Jordy, who in turn is a direct threat to Mark. So by Mark keeping Josh, he's keeping around a number that could protect him later down the road. So there's that. But again, I feel like Josh is playing a solid enough game. However, the edit is just not there for him. Like I feel like, like he has been getting some content here or there, but I feel like it's just not really enough to propel him. And while he does survive the tribal, I mean, he doesn't get too much credit for it at the end of the day. I feel like it was more so presented as a conflict between Jesse and Jordy side and the Mark and Sam side. So because of that, I can't have him too high at number 5, although I will admit I'm very impressed by the game he's actually playing. Now we're moving on to number 4, and this is definitely a weird person to talk about. And here we have Chrissy. And the thing about Chrissy is I feel like she's been sort of disappearing from the show. I mean, in episode 15, we do learn about her alliance with her, Josh, and David. And then after winning the reward, we see her looking for idol clues, but is unsuccessful in doing so. And then later on, she is included on the plan to blindside Jesse. And then in episode 16, again, she's sort of in the majority for that. However, I feel like, again, she's largely been disappearing from the show lately, and I'm not entirely sure why. I mean, it could be because she could be set up for a downfall towards the end of the game, and maybe she becomes more relevant then. But even then, like, I'm still surprised that the show hasn't been focusing on her more, especially after how big she was in the pre-merge. So that's definitely something that's concerning me. Again, she's obviously not really in winner contention at this point, but I still find it weird that she has been sort of vanishing from the show for a bit despite being this big character. And again, gameplay wise, while she is in this core, I don't feel like she's that big of a power player at the end of the day. I feel like more of the power is centered around people like Josh and Mark, so I feel like that's something to her detriment gameplay wise. But again, I mean, I feel like with her previous exposure in the pre-merge, I feel like that is enough to have her here as number 4, but not really too much higher. So she's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and again, this is sort of a new tier for me. I feel like these top 3 are the only 3 that have any real win equity at this point. But number 3, at the person with by far the least of the 3, we have Jordy. And again, Jordy's been a largely big character so far in this post-merge. I mean, obviously in episode 15, we saw him continually be on the trail about Mark and Sam. We see him after the reward pick Jesse, of course, go along with there. And of course, he's the one to spot the idol clue during the reward, but he's able to pass it off to Jesse, which is pretty effective. He then is put into prime danger where we see Mark and Sam really come around to turn against him and get Josh on board to the point where if Jordy didn't win immunity, there was a solid chance he could have been voted out, which is definitely knocked to his game, but he is able to pull it out, win immunity there. Afterwards, we see him sort of try to get the wheels moving on a Josh blindside, and through that have Jesse find the idol. Mind you, Jesse was more so acting on his own there, but still, it is something that affects Jordy. But at the same time, we see Mark and Sam really plot against Jesse. We have Mark literally say that Jesse will be paying for the mistakes that Jordy was making, which is definitely something at least. And while Jesse does find the idol, Sam is able to get it away from him. And of course, he is blindsided at tribal, and Jesse is able to tell Jordy that Sam has the idol now, which is what obviously leads Jordy into blaming Sam for Jesse's blindside the previous tribal, really leading the charge against Mark and Sam. He once again wins immunity, which is again probably something that he needed. And then afterwards really lead the charge against Mark, trying to get the people on board, but is unsuccessful in doing so. Shale goes home instead. And like I said, I feel like Jordy is the third biggest character of the season up to this point. I feel like he is someone who is probably the main villain or the main obstacle towards Mark and Sam winning. And I feel like while Mark and Sam will obviously win that battle at the end of the day, I feel like Jordy is by far the most developed character up to this point, and certainly the most developed character of the people still in the game. And I feel like he has the best shot of making it towards the end of the game. Although if he does lose immunity in the next few rounds, I feel like Mark and Sam will probably get the upper hand in getting him out. But still, considering the rest of the field and the fact that they are either irrelevant to the gameplay or invisible, I feel like Jordy is probably the best likely winner of the people outside of Mark and Sam. So because of that, I'm here at number 3. And now at number 2, it's the same top 2 as always, and I feel like the order is now more solidified than ever. At number 2, we have Sam, and I feel like this was a pretty bad episode for Sam, at least in terms of her winning the game when she gets to the end. Where obviously in episode 15, she gets quite a bit of content centering on her relationships with Mark and Jesse. We hear her talk about how she wants a final 4 of her, Mark, Jesse, and Jordy. She's shown talking about Josh as a big threat and how her and Mark aren't on the same page. However, later in the episode, she agrees that Jordy is a big threat. But then obviously after Jordy wins immunity, like she talks about how she needs to get Josh out, but only for Mark to later say that Jesse needs to go, which is sort of a hard pill for her to swallow, but then she seems to get on board with it, which is sort of interesting. Obviously, Jesse then goes and finds the idol, and she walks in on him doing so, and she somehow convinces him to hand over the idol for safekeeping, only for her to hold on to it herself as she's blindsiding Jesse. And I thought at the time that this was a pretty bad move for Sam. I mean, I understand why she was forced into it, as it seemed like Mark's alliance was all in on it and she didn't really have the numbers to flip. However, I think now that we know that she actually gets to keep Jesse's idol, it's a little bit better. However, at the end of the day, I still feel like she really burns Jesse on the way out. And we see that in Jesse's Ponderosa video where he's talking about how upset he is at Sam over blindsiding her. And I feel like at this point, if Mark and Sam get to the end, Jesse would probably vote for Mark over Sam. And I could see see a scenario where Sam loses a jury vote at this point. I mean, not because of that per se, but because of perception, the idea that she's just been doing what Mark has been telling her to do, which is kind of true to a degree. I mean, we definitely see a lot in the edit how Sam disagrees with Mark, or how she feels like she's being told what to do. Yet at each of these tribals so far, she has ultimately gone along with what Mark wants. And again, I feel like Jesse going home here is something that benefits Mark way more than Sam, as again, I feel like Mark is someone who again is better positioned by having Josh in the game over Jesse. And while it's a bit better for Sam in the sense that she now has an idol of her own, I feel like the other factors in episode 16 where we see Jordy sort of blame Sam for the blind side, and while he sets his eyes on Mark as the blind side in order to get Sam to sort of go chaotic, I mean, it's still a sign that Jordy blames Sam more for the Jesse blind side than Mark, even though Mark seemed to be the one who benefits more from that. So on the whole, I feel like Sam is definitely one of the more complex characters of the season, and even in episode 16 we did hear talk about blindsiding Jesse and how it's a good thing that you got the idol from him. But at the end of the day, I feel like gameplay wise, she has been giving up more of her allies and Mark has been giving up his. And I feel like through that, plus with Jesse getting upset at her and the perception of Sam just following along Mark, I feel like that's something that could really harm her even if she gets to the end of the game. So because of that, I have to leave her here at number 2. And now at number 1, I mean, it's Mark. And again, I feel like at this point, I feel like he's pretty clearly the frontrunner at this point, even with Sam getting more content than him. I mean, in episode 15, we get quite a bit of content from him being in the majority. Josh tells him that Jordy told him about his idol, which gets Mark suspicious of Jordy. We later see him and Sam talk to Jordy, has a confessional about his military background and how he knows Jordy is lying, prompting him to target Jordy. And obviously, Jordy wins immunity, which causes him to shift the target to Jesse, seeing it as collateral damage for Jordy's actions. And despite Jesse being one of Sam's closest allies, he's able to get her on board with the plan, and then ultimately the Jesse blindside goes through while Sam gets an idol from him. And then in episode 16, admittedly it's a bit of a quieter episode for him. I mean, he is technically being targeted by Jordy as a way of weakening Sam. However, I never really got the sense that Mark had a shot at being voted out, as we really see his alliance of him, Sam, Josh, and Jordan really come together and really hold the numbers there, get out Shale as a result. And overall, again, I feel like this was a better week for Mark despite not getting that much content compared to Sam, as I feel like, again, he's been getting his way more often than not. I mean, we see Sam literally voting out her own allies in Khan and now Jesse, while Mark gets to hold on to his people like Josh and Jordan, for example. And I feel like because of that, Mark is definitely being better positioned to get to the end, and because he's been getting his way, I feel like that's been propping him up to actually win a jury vote at the end. I feel like that's best encapsulated by him getting Sam to vote out Jesse here, where yes, Sam seemed to be more on board with it than she was about voting out some of her previous allies, mainly Khan. But I feel like with Jesse being so upset at Sam for betraying her, I feel like it could definitely set up a situation where Jesse, while definitely being a better gamer, and probably not someone who's susceptible to being bitter, will probably look at the situation and see it as Mark forcing Sam's hand and then Mark getting his way more often than not, while Sam doesn't really stand up for herself as much, which, warranted or not, is what he might end up perceiving. And I feel like through that definitely benefits Mark. As I said, Jesse going home definitely benefits Mark's position a lot more than it benefits Sam's. And even with him being targeted in episode 16, Jordy did it as a way of weakening Sam, as he blamed Sam more for Jesse's blindside than Mark did, even though Mark technically benefits more from it by keeping Josh around someone who is skeptical of Jordy and would definitely want to get Jordy out at some point. So I definitely, those are all things going in Mark's favor. And even in episode 15, I really love that military confessional of him figuring out that Jordy is lying, and I feel like that was pretty good for him. Again, I feel like he will win the battle against Jordy, get Jordy out at some point, and from there he should be in a pretty solid position to get towards the end game. Now, the one person that could compromise that from a gameplay perspective is Josh, but given how invisible Josh has been in the edit for most of the season, I feel like that shouldn't be too much of an issue for Mark. I feel like Josh is being more set up as a final obstacle than anything else. And again, I feel pretty good about Mark. He's been getting the edit, he's been getting the solid gameplay, and I feel like this post-merge has definitely worked out a lot better for him than it has for Sam, and I feel like he could definitely win a jury vote if he gets to the end. So I feel like there's just a lot of stuff going in Mark's favor, and because of that, I feel like Mark is the most likely person to win Australian Survivor, Blood versus Water. And there we go, that will do it for this video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And moving forward, like I said, I'm going to be continuing to cover Australian Survivor, doing these weekly Power Rankings, but also Survivor 42 starts today, which is very exciting as well. Stay tuned for Power Rankings for that. And I'll be updating my Power Rankings for Big Brother Canada soon, so stay tuned for all that. There's a lot of stuff going on. Admittedly, it is slowing down a bit as these last couple weeks were a bit crazy with Celebrity Big Brother and Amazing Race wrapping up, so I had to make videos to wrap up those series. So it's going to be a bit slower, but it's still going to be quite a bit of content moving forward, so stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. See ya.